Confessions by Heinrich Heine. Heine wrote these confessions, which form one of his most characteristic works, in the winter of 18,534. They were originally intended to form part of the book on Germany. The translation here given is Mr. Fleischmann's, revised by collation with the original. A witty Frenchman a few years ago these words would have been a pleonasmance dubbed me an unfrocked romanticist. I have a weakness for all that is witty and spiteful. As was this appellation, it nevertheless delighted me highly, notwithstanding the war of extermination that I had waged against romanticism. I always remained a romanticist at heart, and that in a higher degree than I myself realized, after I had delivered the most deadly blows against the taste for romantic poetry in Germany. There stole over me an inexpressible yearning for the blue flower in the fairyland of romanticism, and I grasped the magic lyre, and sang a song wherein I gave full sway to all the sweet extravagances, to all the intoxication of moonlight, to all the blooming nightingale-like fancies once so fondly loved. I know it was the last free-forest song of Romanticism 15, and I am its last poet. With me, the old German lyric school ends, while with me at the same time, the modern lyric school of Germany begins. Writers on German literature will assign to me this double role. It would be unseemly for me to speak at length on the subject, but I may with justice claim a liberal space in the history of German Romanticism. For this reason, I ought to have included in my account of the Romantic School a review of my own writings. By my omission to do this, a gap has been left which I cannot easily fill. To write a criticism of oneself is an embarrassing, even an impossible task. I should be a conceited coxcomb to obtrude the good might be able to say of myself, and I should be a great fool to proclaim to the whole world the defects of which I might also be conscious. And even with the most honest desire to be sincere, one cannot tell the truth about oneself. No one has as yet succeeded in doing it, neither St. Augustine, the pious Bishop of Hippo, nor the Genevese Jean-Jacques Rousseauist. Of all the latter, who proclaimed himself the man of truth and nature, but was really much more untruthful and unnatural than his contemporaries. Rousseau, who in his own person also slandered human nature, was yet true to it in respect to our primitive weakness, which consists in always wishing to appear in the eyes of the world as something different from what we really are. His self-portraiture is a lie admirably executed, but still only a brilliant lie. I recently read an anecdote concerning the King of Ashanti, which illustrates in a very amusing manner this weakness of human nature. When Major Bowditch was dispatched by the English governor of the Cape of Good Hope as resident ambassador to the court of that powerful African monarch, he sought to ingratiate himself with the courtiers, especially with the court ladies, by taking their portraits. The king, who was astonished at the accuracy of the likenesses, requested that he also might be painted, and had already had several sittings when the artist noticed in the features of the king, who had often sprung up to observe the progress of the picture, the peculiar restlessness and embarrassment of one who has a request on the tip of his tongue, and yet hesitates to express it. The painter pressed his majesty to tell his wish, until at last the poor African king inquired in a low voice if he could not be painted white. And so it is the swarthy Negro king wishes to be painted white. But do not laugh at the poor African. Every human being is such another Negro king, and all of us would like to appear before the public in a different color from that which fate has given us. Fully realizing this, I took heed not to draw my own portrait in my review of the Romantic School, but in the following pages I shall have ample occasion to speak of myself, and this will to a certain extent fill up the gap caused by the lacking portrait, for I have here undertaken to describe for the reader's benefit and enlightenment the philosophical and religious changes which have taken place in the author's mind since my book on Germany was written. Fear not that I shall paint myself too white, and my fellow beings too black. I shall always give my own colors with exact fidelity, so that it may be known how far my judgment is to be trusted when I draw the portraits of others. Madame de Staël's hate of the emperor is the soul of her book De l'Allemagne, and although his name is nowhere mentioned, one can see at every line how the writer squints at the Tuileries. I doubt not that the book annoyed the emperor more than the most direct attack, for nothing so much irritates a man as a woman's petty needlepricks. We are prepared for great sabre strokes, and instead we are tickled at the most sensitive spots. Oh, the women, we must forgive them much, for they love much and many. Their hate is in fact only love turned the wrong way. At times they try to injure us, but only because they hope thereby to please some other man. When they write, they have one eye on the paper, and the other on a man. This rule applies to all authoresses, with the exception of Countess Han, who only has one eye. We male authors have also our prejudices. We write for, or against something for, or against an idea for or against a party, but women always write for or against one particular man, or to express it more correctly on account of one particular man. We men will sometimes lie outright. Women, like all passive creatures, seldom invent, but can so distort a fact that they can thereby injure us more surely than by a downright lie. I verily believe my friend Balzac was right when he once said to me in a sorrowful tone, La femme est un très dangereux. Yes, women are dangerous, but I must admit that beautiful women are not so dangerous as those whose attractions are intellectual, rather than physical. For the former are accustomed to have men pay court to them, while the latter meet the vanity of men halfway, and through the bait of flattery, acquire a more powerful influence than the beautiful women. I by no means intend to insinuate that Madame de Staël was ugly, but beauty is something quite different. She had single points which were pleasing, but the effect as a whole was anything but pleasing to nervous persons, like the sainted Schiller. Her custom of continually twirling between her fingers some fragment of paper or similar small article was particularly annoying. This habit made poor Schiller dizzy, and in desperation, he grasped her pretty hand to hold it quiet. This innocent action led Madame de Staël to believe that the tender-hearted poet was overpowered by the magic of her personal charms. I am told that she really had very pretty hands and beautiful arms, which she always displayed. Surely, the Venus of Milo could not show such beautiful arms. Her teeth surpassed in whiteness those of the finest steed of Araby. She had very large beautiful eyes. A dozen amorets would have found room on her lips, and her smile is said to have been very sweet. Therefore, she could not have been ugly. No woman is ugly, but I venture to say that had fair Helen of Sparta looked so, the Trojan War would not have occurred, and the strongholds of Priam would not have been burned, and Homer would never have sung the wrath of Palladian Achilles. In my memoirs, I relate with more detail than is admissible here how after the French Revolution of July 1830, I emigrated to Paris, where I have ever since lived quiet and contented. What I did and suffered during the Restoration will be told when the disinterestedness of such a publication is no longer liable to doubt or suspicion. I worked much and suffered much, and about the time that the sun of the July Revolution arose in France, I had gradually become very weary and needed recreation. Moreover, the air of my native land was daily becoming more unwholesome for me, and I was compelled to contemplate seriously a change of climate. I had visions in the clouds. I saw all sorts of horrible, grotesque faces that annoyed me with their grimaces. It sometimes seemed to me as if the sun were a Prussian cockade at night. I dreamed of a hideous black vulture that preyed on my liver, and became very melancholy. In addition to all this, I had become acquainted with an old magistrate from Berlin who had spent many years in the fortress of Spandau, and who described to me how unpleasant it was in winter to wear iron manacles. I thought it very unchristian not to warm the irons a little, for if our chains were only warmed somewhat, they would not seem so very unpleasant, and cold natures could even endure them very well. The chains ought also to be perfumed with the essence of roses and laurels, as is the custom in France. I asked my magistrate if oysters were often served at Spandau. He answered no, Spandau was too far distant from the sea. Meat also, he said, was seldom to be had, and the only fowls were the flies which fell into one's soup. About the same time, I became acquainted with a commercial traveler of a French wine establishment who was never tired of praising the merry life of Paris. The air was full of music. How from morning until night one heard the singing of the Marseillaise and En avant marchons and Lafayette aux cheveux blancs. He told me that at every street corner was the inscription Liberty, Equality, Fraternity. He likewise recommended the champagne of his firm, and gave me a large number of business cards. He also promised to furnish me with letters of introduction to the best Parisian restaurants, in case I should visit Paris, as I really did need recreation, and as Spandau was at too great a distance from the sea to procure oysters, and as the fowl soup of Spandau was not to my taste, and as moreover the Prussian chains were very cold in winter, and could not be conducive to my health, I determined to go to Paris, the fatherland of champagne, and the Marseillaise, there to drink the former, and to hear the latter sung together with En avant marchons and Lafayette aux cheveux blancs. I crossed the Rhine on May 1st, 1830, when I did not see the old river god Father Rhine, so I contented myself with dropping my visiting card into the water. I am told that he was sitting down below conning his French grammar, for during the Prussian rule his French had grown rusty from long disuse, and now, He wished to practice it anew, in order to be prepared for contingencies. I thought I could hear him conjugating jame two aims, ill aim nous aimants, but what does he love? Surely not the Prussians. I awoke at St. Denis from a sweet morning sleep, and heard for the first time the shout of the driver, Paris, Paris. Here, we already inhaled the atmosphere of the capital, now visible on the horizon. A rascally lackey tried to persuade me to visit the royal sepulchre at St. Denis. But I had not come to France to see dead kings. In 20 minutes, I was in Paris, entering through the triumphal arch of the Boulevard St. Denis, which was originally erected in honor of Louis Roman XIV, but now served to grace my entry into Paris. I was surprised at meeting such multitudes of well-dressed people, tastefully arrayed like the pictures of a fashion journal. I was also impressed by the fact that they all spoke French, which in Germany is the distinguishing mark of the higher classes. The whole nation are as noble as the nobility with us. The men were all so polite, and the pretty women all smiled so graciously. If someone accidentally jostled me without immediately asking pardon, I could safely wager that it was a fellow countryman, and if a pretty woman looked a little sour, she had either eaten sauerkraut or could read Klopstock in the original. I found everything quite charming. The skies were so blue, the air so balmy, and here and there the rays of the sun of July were still glimmering, the cheeks of the beauteous Lutetia were still flushed from the burning kisses of that sun, and the bridal flowers on her bosom were not yet wilted. But at the street corners, the words Libert, Egalite, Fraternite had already been erased. Honeymoons fly so quickly. I immediately visited the restaurants, to which I had been recommended. The landlords assured me that they would have made me welcome even without letters of introduction, for I had an honest and distinguished appearance, which in itself was a sufficient recommendation. Never did a German landlord so address me, even if he thought it. Such a churlish fellow feels himself in duty bound to suppress all pleasant speeches, and his German bluntness demands that he shall tell only the most disagreeable things to our faces. In the manner, and even in the language of the French, there is so much delicious flattery, which costs so little, and is yet so gratifying. My poor sensitive soul, which had shrunk with shyness from the rudeness of the fatherland, again expanded under the genial influence of French urbanity. God has given us tongues, that we may say something pleasant to our fellow men. My French had grown rusty since the Battle of Waterloo, but after half an hour's conversation with a pretty flower girl in the Passage de l'Opéra, it soon flowed fluently again. I managed to stammer forth gallant phrases in broken French, and explained to the little charmer the linen system, in which flowers are classified according to their stamens. The little one practiced a different system, and divided flowers into those which smelled pleasantly, and those which smelled unpleasantly. I believe that she applied a similar classification to men. She was surprised that, notwithstanding my youth, I was so learned, and spread the fame of my erudition through the whole Passage de l'Opéra. I inhaled with rapturous delight the delicious aroma of flattery, and amused myself charmingly. I walked on flowers, and many a roasted pigeon came flying into my gaping mouth. Among the notabilities whom I met soon after my arrival in Paris was Victor Bohane, and I love to recall to memory the jovial intellectual form of him, who did so much to dispel the clouds from the brow of the German dreamer, and to initiate his sorrowlate heart into the gaieties of French life. He had at that time already founded the Europe Littéraire, and as editor solicited me to write for his journal several articles on Germany after the genre of Madame de Staël. I promised to furnish the articles particularly, mentioning however that I should write them in a style quite different from that of Madame de Staël. That is a matter of indifference to me, was the laughing answer. Like Voltaire, I tolerate every genre excepting only the genre ennuyeux, and in order that I poor German should not fall into the genre ennuyeux. Friend Bohane often invited me to dine with him, and stimulated my brain with champagne. No one knew better than he how to arrange a dinner at which one should not only enjoy the best cuisine, but be most pleasantly entertained. No one could do the honors of host as well as he, and he was certainly justified in charging the stockholders of the Europe Littéraire with 100,000 francs. As the expense of these banquets, even his wooden leg contributed to the humor of the man, and when he hobbled around the table serving out champagne to his guests, he resembled Vulcan performing the duties of Hebe's office amidst the uproarious mirth of the assembled gods. Whereas Victor Bohane, now, I have heard nothing of him for a long period. The last I saw of him was about 10 years ago at an inn at Granville. He had just come over from England, where he had been studying the colossal English national debt. In this occupation, smothering the recollection of his own little personal debts, to this little town on the coast of Normandy, and here, I found him seated at a table with a bottle of champagne and an open-mouthed, stupid-looking citizen, to whom he was earnestly explaining a business project, by which, as Heine eloquently demonstrated, 1,000,000 could be realized. Heine always had a great fondness for speculation, and in all his projects there was always 1,000,000 in progress, never less than 1,000,000. His friends nicknamed him on this account Messer Milione. The founding of the Europe Littéraire was an excellent idea. Its success seemed assured, and I have never been able to understand why it failed only one evening before the day on which the suspension occurred. Victor Heine gave a brilliant ball in the editorial salons of the journal, at which he danced with his 300 stockholders, just like Leonidas, with his 300 Spartans the day before the Battle of Thermopylae. Every time that I behold in the gallery of the Louvre the painting by David which portrays that scene of antique heroism, I am reminded of the last ball of Victor Heine. Just like the death-defying king in David's picture, so stood Victor Heine on his solitary leg. It was the same classic pose, stranger, when thou strollest in Paris through the Chaussee d'Antin towards the boulevards, and findest thyself in the lowlying filthy street that was once called the Rue Basse du Rempart. Know that thou standest at the Thermopylae of the Europe Littéraire, where Victor Heine with his 300 stockholders so heroically fell. In my articles on German philosophy, I blabbed without reserve the secrets of the schools which, draped in scholastic formulas, were previously known only to the initiated. My revelations excited the greatest surprise in France, and I remember that leading French thinkers naively confessed to me that they had always believed German philosophy to be a peculiar mystic fog, behind which divinity lay hidden as in a cloud, and that German philosophers were ecstatic seers filled with piety and the fear of God. It is not my fault that German philosophy is just the reverse of that which, until now, we have called piety and fear of God, and that our latest philosophers have proclaimed absolute atheism to be the last word of German philosophy. Relentlessly, and with bacchantic recklessness, they tore aside the blue curtain from the German heavens, and cried, "Behold, all the gods have flown, and there above sits only an old spinster with leaden hands and sorrowful heart." Necessity. Alas, what then sounded so strange is now being preached from all the housetops in Germany, and the fanatic zeal of many of these propagandists is terrible. We have now bigoted monks of atheism, grand inquisitors of infidelity, who would have bound Voltaire to the stake, because he was at heart an obstinate deist, so long as such doctrines remained the secret possession of an intellectual aristocracy, and were discussed in a select coterie, which was incomprehensible to the lackeys in attendance, while we at our philosophical petit soupers were blaspheming. So long did I continue to be one of the thoughtless freethinkers of whom the majority resembled those grand seigneurs who, shortly before the Revolution, sought by means of the new revolutionary ideas to dispel the tedium of their indolent court life. But as soon as I saw that the rabble began to discuss the same themes at their unclean symposiums, where instead of wax candles and chandeliers gleamed tallow dips and oil lamps, when I perceived that greasy cobblers and tailors presumed in their blunt mechanics speech to deny the existence of God, when atheism began to stink of cheese, brandy, and tobacco, then my eyes were suddenly opened, and that which I had not comprehended through reason, I now learned through my olfactory organs, and through my loathing and disgust. Heaven be praised, my atheism was at an end. To be candid, it was perhaps not alone disgust that made the principles of the godless obnoxious to me, and induced me to abandon their ranks. I was oppressed by a certain worldly apprehension, which I could not overcome, for I saw that atheism had entered into a more or less secret compact with the most terribly naked, quite figleafless communistic communism. My dread of the latter has nothing in common with that of the parvenu who trembles for his wealth, or with that of well-to-do tradesmen who fear an interruption of their profitable business. No, that which disquiets me is the secret dread of the artist and scholar who sees our whole modern civilization, the laboriously achieved product of so many centuries of effort, and the fruit of the noblest works of our ancestors, jeopardized by the triumph of communism, swept along by the resistless current of generous emotions. We may perhaps sacrifice the cause of art and science, even all our own individual interests, for the general welfare of the suffering and oppressed people. But we can no longer disguise from ourselves what we have to expect when the great rude masses, which by some are called the people, by others the rabble, and whose legitimate sovereignty was proclaimed long ago, shall obtain actual dominion, the poet in particular experiences a mysterious dread. In contemplating the advent to power of this uncouth sovereign, we will gladly sacrifice ourselves for the people, for self-sacrifice constitutes one of our most exquisite enjoyments. Emancipation of the people has been the great task of our lives. We have toiled for it, and in its cause endured indescribable misery at home, as in exile. But the poet's refined and sensitive nature revolts at every near personal contact with the people, and still more repugnant is the mere thought of its caresses, from which may heaven preserve us. A great democrat once remarked that if a king had taken him by the hand, he would immediately have thrust it into the fire to purify it. In the same manner, I would say, if the sovereign people vouchsafe to press my hand, I would hasten to wash it. The poor people is not beautiful, but very ugly, only that ugliness simply comes from dirt, and will disappear as soon as we open public baths, in which His Majesty may gratuitously bathe himself. It required no great foresight to foretell these terrible events. So long before their occurrence, I could easily prophesy what songs would one day be whistled and chirped in Germany, for I saw the birds hatching that in after days gave tone to the new school of song. I saw Hegel, with his almost comically serious face like a setting hen brooding over the fatal eggs, and I heard his cackling. To tell the truth, I seldom understood him, and only through later reflection did I arrive at an understanding of his works. I believe he did not wish to be understood. One beautiful starlight night Hegel stood with me at an open window. I, being a young man of 22, and having just eaten well and drunk coffee, naturally spoke with enthusiasm of the stars, and called them abodes of the blessed. But the master muttered to himself, the stars, the stars, are only a brilliant eruption on the firmament. What, cried I then, there is no blissful spot above where virtue is rewarded after death. But he, glaring at me with his dim eyes, remarked, sneering, so you want a pourboire because you have supported your sick mother, and not poisoned your brother. At these words, he looked anxiously around, but was reassured when he saw that it was only Henry Beer. I was never an abstract thinker, and I accepted the synthesis of the Hegelian philosophy without examination. Because its deductions flattered my vanity, I was young and arrogant, and it gratified my self-conceit when I was informed by Hegel that not as my grandmother had supposed he who dwelt in the heavens, but I myself here on earth was God. This silly pride had, however, by no means an evil influence on me. On the contrary, it awoke in me the heroic spirit, and at that period I practiced a generosity and self-sacrifice which completely cast into the shade the most virtuous and distinguished deeds of the good bourgeoisie of virtue, who did good merely from a sense of duty and in obedience to the laws of morality. I was myself the living moral law and the fountainhead of all right and all authority. I myself was morality personified. I was incapable of sin, I was incarnated purity, I was all love and incapable of hate. I no longer revenged myself on my enemies, for rightly considered, I had no enemies. At least I recognized none as such for me. There now existed only unbelievers, who questioned my divinity. Every indignity that they offered me was a sacrilege, and their contumely was blasphemy. Such godlessness, of course, I could not always let pass unpunished, but in those cases it was not human revenge, but divine judgment upon sinners. Absorbed in this exalted practice of justice, I would repress with more or less difficulty all ordinary pity. As I had no enemies, so also there existed for me no friends, but only worshippers who believed in my greatness and adored me, and praised my works, those written in verse as well as those in prose. Towards this congregation of truly devout and pious ones, I was particularly gracious, especially towards the young lady devotees. But the expense of playing the role of a god, for whom it were unseemly to go in tatters, and who is sparing neither of body nor of purse, is immense. To play such a role respectably, two things are above all requisite: much money and robust health. Alas, it happened that one day in February 1848, both these essentials failed me, and my divinity was at an end. Luckily, the highly respected public was at that time occupied with events so dramatic, so grand, so fabulous, and unprecedented that the change in the affairs of so unimportant a personage as myself attracted but little attention. Unprecedented and fabulous were indeed the events of those crazy February days, when the wisdom of the wisest was brought to naught, and the chosen ones of imbecility were raised aloft in triumph. The last became the first, and the lowliest became the highest. Matter, like thought, was turned upside down, and the world was topsy-turvy. If in those mad days I had been sane, those events would surely have cost me my wits, but lunatic, as I then was. The contrary necessarily came to pass, and strange to say, just in the days of universal madness, I regained my reason. Like many other divinities of that revolutionary period, I was compelled to abdicate ignominiously, and to return to the lowly life of humanity. I came back into the humble fold of God's creatures. I again bowed in homage to the almighty power of a supreme being who directs the destinies of this world, and who for the future shall also regulate my earthly affairs. The latter, during the time I had been my own providence, had drifted into sad confusion, and I was glad to turn them over to a celestial superintendent, who with his omniscience really manages them much better. The belief in God has since then been to me not only a source of happiness, but it has also relieved me from all those annoying business cares, which are so distasteful to me. This belief has also enabled me to practice great economies, for I need no longer provide either for myself or for others. And since I have joined the ranks of the pious, I contribute almost nothing to the support of the poor. I am too modest to meddle, as formerly, with the business of divine providence. I am no longer careful for the general good. I no longer ape the deity, and with pious humility I have notified my former dependents that I am only a miserable human being, a wretched creature that has not more to do with governing the universe, and that in future, when in need and affliction, they must apply to the supreme ruler who dwells in heaven, and whose budget is as inexhaustible as his goodness. Whereas I, a poor ex-god, was often compelled, even in the days of my godhead, to seek the assistance of the devil, it was certainly very humiliating for a god to have to apply to the devil for aid, and I am heartily thankful to be relieved from my usurped glory. No philosopher shall ever again persuade me that I am a god. I am only a poor human creature that is not over well, that is indeed very Roman 99 in this pitiable condition. It is a true comfort to me that there is some one in the heavens above to whom I can incessantly wail out the litany of my sufferings, especially after midnight, when Mathilda has sought the repose that she oft sadly needs. Thank God, in such hours I am not alone, and I can pray and weep without restraint. I can pour out my whole heart before the Almighty, and confide to Him some things which one is wont to conceal even from one's own wife. After the above confession, the kindly disposed reader will easily understand why I no longer found pleasure in my work on the Hegelian philosophy. I saw clearly that its publication would benefit neither the public nor the author. I comprehended that there is more nourishment for famishing humanity in the most watery and insipid broth of Christian charity than in the dry and musty spiderweb of the Hegelian philosophy. I will confess, all of a sudden, I was seized with a mortal terror of the eternal flames. I know it is a mere superstition, but I was frightened. And so, on a quiet winter's night, when a glowing fire was burning on my hearth, I availed myself of the good opportunity, and cast the manuscript of my work on the Hegelian philosophy into the flames. The burning leaves flew up the chimney with a strange and hissing sound. Thank God I was rid of it. Alas, would that I could destroy in the same manner all that I have ever published concerning German philosophy, but that is impossible, and since I cannot prevent their republication, as I lately learned to my great regret, no other course remains but to confess publicly that my exposition of German philosophy contains the most erroneous and pernicious doctrines. It is strange, during my whole life, I have been strolling through the various festive halls of philosophy, I have participated in all the orgies of the intellect, I have coquetted with every possible system, without being satisfied, like Messalina after a riotous night. And now, after all this, I suddenly find myself on the same platform, whereon stands Uncle Tom. That platform is the Bible, and I kneel by the side of my dusky brother in faith with the same devotion. What humiliation! With all my learning, I have got no farther than the poor ignorant Negro, who can hardly spell it. Is even true that poor Uncle Tom appears to see in the Holy Book more profound things than I, who am not yet quite clear, especially in regard to the second part. But on the other hand, I think I may flatter myself that I can better comprehend in the first part of the Holy Book. The character of Moses, his grand figure, has impressed me not a little. What a colossal form! I cannot imagine that Og, king of Bashan, could have looked more giant-like. How insignificant does Sinai appear when Moses stands thereon! That mountain is merely a pedestal for the feet of the man whose head towers in the heavens, and there holds converse with God. May God forgive the sacrilegious thought. But sometimes it appears to me as if this Mosaic God were only the reflected radiance of Moses himself, whom he so strongly represents in wrath, and in love it were a sin, it were anthropomorphism, to assume such an identity of God and his prophet. but the resemblance is most striking. I had not previously much admired the character of Moses, probably because the Hellenic spirit was predominant in me, and I could not pardon the lawgiver of the Jews for his hate of the plastic arts. I failed to perceive that Moses, notwithstanding his enmity to art, was nevertheless himself a great artist, and possessed the true artistic spirit. Only this artistic spirit with him, as with his Egyptian countrymen, was applied to the colossal and the imperishable, but not like the Egyptians did he construct his works of art from bricks and granite. But he built human pyramids and carved human obelisks. He took a poor shepherd tribe, and from it created a nation, which should defy centuries, a great and immortal, a consecrated race, a God-serving people who to all other nations should be as a model and prototype. He created Israel. I have never spoken with proper reverence either of the artist or of his work, the Jews, and for the same reason, namely my Hellenic temperament, which was opposed to Jewish asceticism, my prejudice in favor of Hellas, has declined since then. I see now that the Greeks were only beautiful youths, but that the Jews were always men, strong, unyielding men, not only in the past, but to this very day, in spite of 18 centuries of persecution and suffering since that time. I have learned to appreciate them better, and were not all pride of ancestry, a silly inconsistency in a champion of the revolution and its democratic principles. The writer of these pages would be proud that his ancestors belonged to the noble house of Israel, that he is a descendant of those martyrs who gave the world a God and a morality, and who have fought and suffered on all the battlefields of thought. The histories of the Middle Ages, and even those of modern times, have seldom enrolled on their records the names of such knights of the Holy Spirit, for they generally fought with closed visors. The deeds of the Jews are just as little known to the world as is their real character. Some think they know the Jews because they can recognize their beards, which is all they have ever revealed of themselves now, as during the Middle Ages they remain a wandering mystery, a mystery that may perhaps be solved on the day which the prophet foretells, when there shall be but one shepherd and one flock, and the righteous who have suffered for the good of humanity shall then receive a glorious reward. You see that I, who in the past was wont to quote Homer, now quote the Bible like Uncle Tom. In truth, I owe it much. It again awoke in me the religious feeling, and this new birth of religious emotion suffices for the poet, for he can dispense far more easily than other mortals with positive religious dogmas. The silliest and most contradictory reports are in circulation concerning me. Very pious, but not very wise men of Protestant Germany have urgently inquired if now that I am ill, and in a religious frame of mind, I cling with more devotion than heretofore to the Lutheran evangelic faith, which until now I have only professed after a lukewarm official fashion. No, dear friends, in that respect, no change has taken place in me, and if I continue to adhere to the evangelic faith at all, it is because now, as in the past, that faith does not at all inconvenience me. I will frankly avow that, when I resided in Berlin like several of my friends, I would have preferred to separate myself from the bonds of all denominations, had not the rulers there refused a residence in Prussia, and especially in Berlin, to any who did not profess one of the positive religions recognized by the state, as Henry Roman IV once laughingly said, Paris vaut bien une messe. So could I say with equal justice, Berlin is well worth a sermon both before and after. I could easily tolerate the very enlightened Christianity, which at that time was preached in some of the churches of Berlin. It was a Christianity filtered from all superstition, even from the doctrine of the divinity of Christ, like mock turtle soup without turtle. At that time, I myself was still a god, and no one of the positive religions had more value for me than another. I could wear any of their uniforms out of courtesy, after the manner of the Russian emperor who, when he vouchsafes the King of Prussia the honor to attend a review at Potsdam, appears uniformed as a Prussian officer of the guard. Now that my physical sufferings and the reawakening of my religious nature have effected in me many changes, does the uniform of Lutheranism in some measure express my true sentiments? How far has the formal profession become a reality? I do not propose to give direct answers to these questions, but I shall avail myself of the opportunity to explain the services which, according to my present views, Protestantism has rendered to civilization. From this may be inferred how much more I am now in sympathy with this creed. At an earlier period, when philosophy possessed for me a paramount interest, I prized Protestantism only for its services in winning freedom of thought, which after all is the foundation on which in later times Leibniz, Kant, and Hegel could build Luther the strong man with the axe must, in the very nature of things, have preceded these warriors to open a path for them for this service. I have honored the Reformation as being the beginning of German philosophy, which justified my polemical defense of Protestantism. Now in my later and more mature days, when the religious feeling again surges up in me, and the shipwrecked metaphysician clings fast to the Bible, no, I chiefly honor Protestantism for its services in the discovery and propagation of the Bible. I say discovery for the Jews who had preserved the Bible from the great conflagration of the sacred temple, and all through the Middle Ages, carried it about with them like a portable fatherland, kept their treasure carefully concealed in their ghettos. Here came by stealth German scholars, the predecessors and originators of the Reformation, to study the Hebrew language, and thus acquire the key to the casket wherein the precious treasure was enclosed. Such a scholar was the worthy Ruchlinus, and his enemies the Hochstraten in Cologne, who are represented as the party of darkness and ignorance, were by no means such simpletons. On the contrary, they were far-sighted inquisitors, who foresaw clearly the disasters which a familiar acquaintance with the Holy Scriptures would bring on the Church. Hence the persecuting zeal with which they sought to destroy the Hebrew writings, at the same time inciting the rabble to exterminate the Jews, the interpreters of these writings. Now that the motives of their actions are known, we see that, properly considered, each was in the right. This reactionary party believed that the spiritual salvation of the world was endangered, and that all means, falsehood as well as murder, were justifiable, especially against the Jews. The lower classes, pinched by poverty and heirs of the primeval curse, were embittered against the Jews because of the wealth they had amassed, and what today is called the hate of the proletariat against the rich was then called hate against the Jews. In fact, as the latter were excluded from all ownership of land and from every trade and relegated to dealing in money and merchandise, they were condemned by law to be rich, hated, and murdered. Such murders, it is true, were in these days committed under the mantle of religion, and the cry was, "We must kill those who once killed our God." How strange! The very people who had given the world a God, and whose whole life was inspired by the worship of God, were stigmatized as deicides. The bloody parody of such madness was witnessed at the outbreak of the revolution in San Domingo, where a Negro mob devastated the plantations with murder and fire, led by a Negro fanatic, who carried an immense crucifix. Amid bloodthirsty cries of "The whites killed Christ, let us slay all whites." Yes, to the Jews, the world is indebted for its God and His Word. They rescued the Bible from the bankruptcy of the Roman Empire, and preserved the precious volume intact during all the wild tumults of the migration of races, until Protestantism came to seek it, and translated it into the language of the land, and spread it broadcast over the whole world. This extensive circulation of the Bible has produced the most beneficent fruits, and continues to do so to this very day. The propaganda of the Bible Society have fulfilled a providential mission, which will bring forth quite different results from those anticipated by the pious gentlemen of the British Christian Missionary Society. They expect to elevate a petty narrow dogma to supremacy, and to monopolize heaven as they do the sea, making it a British church domain and see. Without knowing it, they are demanding the overthrow of all Protestant sects, for as they all draw their life from the Bible, when the knowledge of the Bible becomes universal, all sectarian distinctions will be obliterated. While by tricks of trade, smuggling, and commerce, the British gain footholds in many lands with them, they bring the Bible, that grand democracy, wherein each man shall not only be king in his own house, but also bishop. They are demanding, they are founding the great kingdom of the Spirit, the kingdom of the religious emotions, and the love of humanity, of purity, of true morality, which cannot be taught by dogmatic formulas, but by parable and example, such as are contained in that beautiful sacred educational book for young and old, the Bible. To the observant thinker, it is a wonderful spectacle to view the countries where the Bible since the Reformation has been exerting its elevating influence on the inhabitants, and has impressed on them the customs, modes of thought, and temperaments, which formerly prevailed in Palestine, as portrayed both in the Old and in the New Testament, in the Scandinavian and Anglo-Saxon sections of Europe and America, especially among the Germanic races, and also to a certain extent in Celtic countries. The customs of Palestine have been reproduced in so marked a degree that we seem to be in the midst of the ancient Judean life. Take, for example, the Scotch Protestants. Are not they Hebrews, whose names even are biblical, whose very cant smacks of the Phariseeism of ancient Jerusalem, and whose religion is naught else than a porky-eating Judaism? It is the same in Denmark and in certain provinces of North Germany, not to mention the majority of the new sects of the United States, among whom the life depicted in the Old Testament is pedantically aped in the latter, that life appears as if daguerreotyped, the outlines are studiously correct, but all is depicted in sad somber colors, the golden tints and harmonizing colors of the promised land are lacking. But the caricature will disappear sooner or later, the zeal the imperishable, and the truth is to say the morality of ancient Judaism will in those countries bloom forth, just as acceptably to God, as in the old time it blossomed on the banks of Jordan, and on the heights of Lebanon. One needs neither palm trees nor camels to be good, and goodness is better than beauty. The readiness with which these races have adopted the Judaic life customs and modes of thought is perhaps not entirely attributable to their susceptibility of culture. The cause of this phenomenon is perhaps to be sought in the character of the Jewish people, which always had a marked elective affinity with the character of the Germanic, and also to a certain extent with that of the Celtic races. Judea has always seemed to me like a fragment of the Occident misplaced in the Orient, in fact with its spiritual faith, its severe chaste even ascetic customs, in short with its abstract inner life, thy's land, and its people always offered the most marked contrasts to the population of neighboring countries, who with their luxuriantly varied and fervent nature of worship, passed their existence in a bacchantic dance of the senses. At a time when in the temples of Babylon, Nineveh, Sidon, and Tyre bloody and unchaste rites were celebrated, the description of which even now makes our hair stand on end, Israel sat under its fig trees, piously chanting the praises of the invisible God, and exercised virtue and righteousness. When we think of these surroundings, we cannot sufficiently admire the early greatness of Israel's love of liberty at a time when not only in its immediate vicinity, but also among all the nations of antiquity, even among the philosophical Greeks, the practice of slavery was justified, and in full sway. Of this I will not speak for fear of compromising the Bible in the eyes of the powers that be. No socialist was more of a terrorist than our Lord and Savior. Even Moses was such a socialist, although like a practical man, he attempted only to reform existing usages concerning property, instead of striving to effect the impossible and rashly decreeing the abolition of private property. He only sought for its moralization, by bringing the rights of property into harmony with the laws of morality and reason. This he accomplished by instituting the Jubilee, at which period every alienated heritage, which among an agricultural people always consisted of land, would revert to the original owner, no matter in what manner it had been alienated. This institution offers the most marked contrast to the Roman statute of limitations, by which after the expiration of a certain period the actual holder of an estate could no longer be compelled to restore the estate to the true owner, unless the latter should be able to show that, within the prescribed time, he had with all the prescribed formalities demanded restitution. This last condition opened wide the door for chicanery, particularly in a state where despotism and jurisprudence were at their zenith, and where the unjust possessor had at command all means of intimidation, especially against the poor who might be unable to defray the expense of litigation. The Roman was both soldier and lawyer, and that which he conquered with the strong arm he knew how to defend by the tricks of law. Only a nation of robbers and casuists could have invented the law of prescription, the statute of limitations, and consecrated it in that detestable book, which may be called the Bible of the Devil, I mean the Codex of Roman Civil Law, which unfortunately still holds sway. I have spoken of the affinity which exists between the Jews and the Germans, whom I once designated as the two preeminently moral nations. While on this subject, I desire to direct attention to the ethical disapprobation with which the ancient German law stigmatizes the statute of limitations. This I consider a noteworthy fact to this very day. The Saxon peasant uses the beautiful and touching aphorism, 100 years of wrong do not make a single year of right. The Mosaic law, through the institution of the Jubilee year, protests, still more decidedly. Moses did not seek to abolish the right of property. On the contrary, it was his wish that everyone should possess property, so that no one might be tempted by poverty to become a bondsman, and thus acquire slavish propensities. Liberty was always the great emancipator's leading thought, and it breathes and glows in all his statutes concerning pauperism. Slavery itself he bitterly, almost fiercely hated, but even this barbarous institution he could not entirely destroy. It was rooted so deeply in the customs of that ancient time that he was compelled to confine his efforts to ameliorating by law the condition of the slaves, rendering self-purchase by the bondsman less difficult and shortening the period of bondage. But if a slave, thus eventually freed by process of law, declined to depart from the house of bondage, then, according to the command of Moses, the incorrigibly servile worthless scamp was to be nailed by the ear to the gate of his master's house, and after being thus publicly exposed in this disgraceful manner, he was condemned to lifelong slavery. O Moses, our teacher, Rabbi Moses, exalted foe of all slavishness, give me hammer and nails that I may nail to the gate of Brandenburg our complacent longered slaves in liveries of black redingold. I leave the ocean of universal religious, moral, and historical reflections, and modestly guide my bark of thought back again into the quiet inland waters of autobiography, in which the author's features are so faithfully reflected. In the preceding pages, I have mentioned how Protestant voices from home in very indiscreet questions have taken for granted that with the reawakening in me of the religious feeling, my sympathy for the Church had also grown stronger. I know not how clearly I have shown that I am not particularly enthusiastic for any dogma or for any creed, and in this respect, I have remained the same that I always was. I repeat this statement in order to remove an error in regard to my present views, into which several of my friends, who are zealous Catholics, have fallen. How strange at the same time that in Germany Protestantism bestowed on me the undeserved honor of crediting me with a conversion to the evangelic faith. Another report was circulating that I had gone over to Catholicism. Some good souls went so far as to assert that this latter conversion had occurred many years ago, and they supported this statement by definitely naming time and place. They even mentioned the exact date. They designated by name the church in which I had abjured the heresy of Protestantism, and adopted the only true and saving faith, that of the Roman Catholic Apostolic Church. The only detail that was lacking was how many peals of the bell had been sounded at this ceremony. From the newspapers and letters that reach me, I learn how widely this report has won credence, and I fall into a painful embarrassment when I think of the sincere loving joy which is so touchingly expressed in some of these epistles. Travelers tell me that the salvation of my soul has even furnished a theme for pulpit eloquence. Young Catholic priests seek permission to dedicate to me the first fruits of their pen. I am regarded as a shining light that is to bay off the Church. This pious folly is so well meant and sincere that I cannot laugh at it, whatever may be said of the zealots of Catholicism. One thing is certain, they are no egotists. They take a warm interest in their fellow Manalas. Often a little too warm an interest. I cannot ascribe that false report to malice, but only to mistake. The innocent facts were in this case surely distorted by accident. Only the statement of time and place is quite correct. I was really in the designated church on the designated day, and I did there undergo a religious ceremony, but this ceremony was no hateful abjuration, but a very innocent conjugation. In short, after being married according to the civil law, I also invoked the sanction of the Church, because my wife, who is a strict Catholic, would not have considered herself properly married in the eyes of God without such a ceremony, and for no consideration would I shake this dear being's belief in the religion which she has inherited. It is well, moreover, that women should have a positive religion. Whether there is more fidelity among wives of the evangelic faith, I shall not attempt to discuss, but the Catholicism of the wife certainly saves the husband from many annoyances. When Catholic women have committed a fault, they do not secretly brood over it but confess to the priest, and as soon as they have received absolution, they are again as merry and light-hearted as before. This is much pleasanter than spoiling the husband's good spirits or his soup by downcast looks, or grieving over a sin for which they hold themselves in duty bound to atone during their whole lives by shrewish prudery and quarrelsome excessive virtue. The confessional is likewise useful in another respect. The sinner does not keep her terrible secret preying on her mind. And since women are sure sooner or later to babble all they know, it is better that they should confide certain matters to their confessor than that they should, in some moment of overpowering tenderness, talkativeness, or remorse, blurt out to the poor husband the fatal confession. Skepticism is certainly dangerous in the married state, and although I myself was a free thinker, I permitted no word derogatory to religion to be spoken in my house in the midst of Paris. I lived like a steady commonplace townsman, and therefore, when I married, I desired to be wedded under the sanction of the Church. Although in this country, the civil marriage is fully recognized by society, My free-thinking friends were vexed at me for this, and overwhelmed me with reproaches claiming that I had made too great concessions to the clergy. Their chagrin at my weakness would have been still greater had they known the other concessions that I had made to the hated priesthood, as I was a Protestant wedding a Catholic. In order to have the ceremony performed by a Catholic priest, it was necessary to obtain a special dispensation from the archbishop, who in these cases exacts from the husband a written pledge that the offspring of the marriage shall be educated in the religion of the mother. But between ourselves, I could sign this pledge with the lighter conscience, since I knew the rearing of children is not my specialty. And as I laid down my pen, the words of the beautiful Ninon de l'Enclos came into my mind: O le beau billet que Leicester. I will crown my confessions by admitting that if at that time it had been necessary, in order to obtain the dispensation of the archbishop, I would have bound over not only the children but myself, but the ogre of Rome, who, like the monster in the fairy tales, stipulates that he shall have for his services the future births, was content with the poor children who were never born. And so I remained a Protestant as before, a protesting Protestant, and I protest against reports, which without being intended to be defamatory, may yet be magnified so as to injure my good name. There is not a particle of unkindly feeling in my breast against the poor ogre of Rome. I have long since abandoned all feuds with Catholicism, and the sword which I once drew in the service of an idea, and not from private grudge, has long rested in its scabbard. In that contest, I resembled a soldier of fortune who fights bravely, but after the battle bears no malice either against the defeated cause or against its champions. Fanatical enmity towards the Catholic Church cannot be charged against me, for there was always lacking in me the self-conceit which is necessary to sustain such an animosity. I know too well my own intellectual caliber, not to be aware that with my most furious onslaughts I could inflict but little injury on a colossus, such as the Church of St. Peter. I could only be a humble worker at the slow removal of its foundation stones, a task which may yet require centuries. I was too familiar with history not to recognize the gigantic nature of that granite structure. Call it, if you will, the Bastille of intellect. Assert, if you choose, that it is now defended only by invalids. But it is therefore not the less true that the Bastille is not to be easily captured, and many a young recruit will break his head against its walls. As a thinker and as a metaphysician, I was always forced to pay the homage of my admiration to the logical consistency of the doctrines of the Roman Catholic Church, and I may also take credit to myself that I have never by witticism or ridicule attacked its dogmas or its public worship. Too much and too little honor has been vouchsafed me in calling me an intellectual kinsman of Voltaire. I was always a poet, and hence the poesy which blossoms and glows in the symbolism of Catholic dogma and culture must have revealed itself more profoundly to me than to ordinary observers, and in my youthful days I was often touched by the infinite sweetness, the mysterious blissful ecstasy, and awe-inspiring grandeur of that poetry. There was a time when I went into raptures over the blessed Queen of Heaven, and in dainty verse told the story of her grace and goodness. My first collection of poems shows traces of this beautiful Madonna period, which in later editions I weeded out with laughable anxiety. The time for vanity has passed, and everyone is at liberty to smile at this confession. It will be unnecessary for me to say that as no blind hate against the Catholic Church exists in me, so also no petty spite against its priests rankles in my heart. Whoever knows my satirical vein will surely bear witness that I was always lenient and forbearing in speaking of the human weaknesses of the clergy, although by their attacks they often provoked in me a spirit of retaliation. But even at the height of my wrath, I was always respectful to the true priesthood, for looking back into the past, I remembered benefits which they had once rendered me. For it is Catholic priests whom I must thank for my first instruction. It was they who guided the first steps of my intellect. Pedagogy was the specialty of the Jesuits, and although they sought to pursue it in the interest of their order, yet sometimes the passion for pedagogy itself, the only human passion that was left in them, gained the mastery. They forgot their aim, the repression of reason and the exaltation of faith, and instead of reducing men to a state of childhood, as was their purpose out of the children, they involuntarily made men by their instruction. The greatest men of the Revolution were educated in Jesuit schools. Without the training, there acquired that great intellectual agitation would perhaps not have broken out till a century later. Poor Jesuit fathers, you have been the bugbear and the scapegoat of the liberals. The danger that was in you was understood, but not your merits. I could never join in the denunciations of my comrades, who at the mere mention of Loyola's name would always become furious like bulls. When a red cloth is held before them, it is certainly noteworthy, and may perhaps at the assizes in the valley of Jehoshaphat be set down as an extenuating circumstance, that even as a lad I was permitted to attend lectures on philosophy. This unusual favor was exceptional in my case, because the rector Schalmir was a particular friend of our family. This venerable man often consulted with my mother in regard to my education and future career, and once advised her, as she afterwards related to me, to devote me to the service of the Catholic Church and send me to Rome to study theology. He assured her that through his influential friends in Rome, he could advance me to an important position in the Church. But at that time, my mother dreamed of the highest worldly honors for me. Moreover, she was a disciple of Rousseau and a strict deist. Besides, she did not like the thought of her son being robed in one of those long black cassocks, such as are worn by Catholic priests, and in which they look so plump and awkward. She knew not how differently, how gracefully a Roman abbate wears such a cassock, and how jauntily he flings over his shoulders the black silk mantle, which in Rome the ever-beautiful is the uniform of gallantry and wit. Oh, what a happy mortal is such a Roman abbate! He serves not only the Church of Christ, but also Apollo, and the Muses whose favorite he is. The Graces hold his inkstand for him when he indites the sonnets, which with such delicate cadences he reads in the Accademia degli Arcadi. He is a connoisseur of art, and needs only to taste the lips of a young songstress, in order to be able to foretell whether she will some day be a celeberrima cantatrice, a diva, a world-renowned prima donna. He understands antiquities, and will write a treatise in the choicest Ciceronian Latin concerning some newly unearthed torso of a Grecian bacchant, reverentially dedicating it to the supreme head of Christendom, to the Pontifex Maximus. For so he addresses him, and what a judge of painting is the Signor Abbate, who visits the painters in their ateliers, and directs their attention to the fine points of their female models. The writer of these pages had in him just the material for such an abbate, and was just suited for strolling in delightful dolce far niente through the libraries, art galleries, churches, and ruins of the eternal city, studying among pleasures and seeking pleasure. While studying, I would have read Mass before the most select audiences, and during Holy Week, I would have mounted the pulpit as a preacher of strict morality. Of course, even then never degenerating into ascetic rudeness, the Roman ladies in particular would have been greatly edified, and through their favor, and my own merit, I would perhaps have risen eventually to high rank in the hierarchy of the Church. I would perhaps have become a Monsignor of violet stocking, perhaps even a cardinal's red hat might have fallen on my head. The proverb says, "There is no priestling, how small soever he be, that does not wish himself a pope to be." And so it might have come to pass that I should attain the most exalted position of all, for although I am not naturally ambitious, I would yet not have refused the nomination for pope. Had the choice of the conclave fallen on me, it is at all events a very respectable office, and has a good income attached to it, and I do not doubt that I could have discharged the duties of my position with the requisite address. I would have seated myself composedly on the throne of St. Peter, presenting my toe for the kisses of all good Christians, the priests, as well as the laity. With a becoming dignity, I would have let myself be carried in triumph through the pillared halls of the great basilica, and only when it tottered very threateningly would I have clung to the arms of the golden throne, which is borne on the shoulders of 6 stalwart camerieri in crimson uniform, by their side walk bald-headed monks of the Capuchin order carrying burning torches. Then follow lackeys in gala dress, bearing aloft immense fans of peacock's feathers, with which they gently fan the prince of the church. It is all just like Horace Vernet's beautiful painting of such a procession, with a like imperturbable sacerdotal gravitifer. I can be very serious. If it be absolutely necessary, from the lofty Lateran, I would have pronounced the annual benediction over all Christendom here, standing on the balcony in pontificalibus, and with the triple crown upon my head, surrounded by my scarlet-hatted cardinals and mitred bishops' priests, in suits of gold brocade and monks of every hue. I would have presented my holiness to the view of the swarming multitudes below, who kneeling and with bowed heads extended farther than the eye could reach, and I could composedly have stretched out my hands and blessed the city and the world. But as thou well knowest, gentle reader, I have not become a pope, nor a cardinal, nor even a papal nuncio. In the spiritual as well as in the worldly hierarchy, I have attained neither office nor rank. I have accomplished nothing in this beautiful world. Nothing has become of me, nothing but a poet. But no, I will not feign a hypocritical humility. I will not depreciate that name. It is much to be a poet, especially to be a great lyric poet in Germany, among a people who in two things in philosophy, and in poetry have surpassed all other nations. I will not with a sham modestized invention of worthless vagabonds depreciate my fame. As a poet, none of my countrymen have won the laurel at so early an age, and if my colleague Wolfgang Goethe complacently writes that the Chinese with trembling hand paints Werther and Lot on porcelain, I can, if boasting is to be in order, match his Chinese fame with one still more legendary, for I have recently learned that my poems have been translated into the Japanese language. But at this moment, I am as indifferent to my Japanese fame as to my renown in Finland. Alas, fame, once sweet as sugared pineapple, and flattery has for a long time been nauseous to me. It tastes as bitter to me now as wormwood. With Romeo I can say I am the fool of fortune. The bowl stands filled before me, but I lack a spoon. What does it avail me that at banquets my health is pledged in the choicest wines, and drunk from golden goblets, when I myself, severed from all that makes life pleasant, may only wet my lips with an insipid potion? What does it avail me that enthusiastic youths and maidens crown my marble bust with laurel wreaths, if meanwhile the shriveled fingers of an aged nurse press a blister of Spanish flies behind the ears of my actual body? What does it avail me that all the roses of Shiraz so tenderly glow and bloom for me? Alas, Shiraz is 2,000 miles away from the Rue d'Amsterdam, where in the dreary solitude of my sick room I have nothing to smell, unless it be the perfume of warmed napkins. Alas, the irony of God weighs heavily upon me. The great author of the universe, the Aristophanes of heaven, wished to show the petty earthly so-called German Aristophanes that his mightiest sarcasms are but feeble banter compared with his, and how immeasurably he excels me in humor and in colossal wit. Yes, the mockery which the master has poured out over me is terrible and horribly cruel. Is his sport? Humbly do I acknowledge his superiority, and I prostrate myself in the dust before him. But although I lack such supreme creative powers, yet in my spirit also the eternal reason flames brightly, and I may summon even the wit of God before its forum, and subject it to a respectful criticism. And here I venture to offer most submissively the suggestion that the sport which the master has inflicted on the poor pupil is rather too long drawn out. It has already lasted over 6 years, and after a time becomes monotonous. Moreover, if I may take the liberty to say it, in my humble opinion the jest is not new, and the great Aristophanes of heaven has already used it on a former occasion, and has therefore been guilty of plagiarism on his own exalted self. In order to prove this assertion, I will quote a passage from the Chronicle of Lüneburg. This chronicle is very interesting for those who seek information concerning the manners and customs of Germany during the Middle Ages. As in a fashion journal, it describes the wearing apparel of both sexes which was in vogue at each particular period. It also imparts information concerning the popular ballads of the day, and quotes the opening lines of several of them. Among others, it records that during the year 1480, there were whistled and sung throughout all Germany certain songs, which for sweetness and tenderness surpassed any previously known in German lands. Young and old, and the women in particular, were quite bewitched by these ballads, which might be heard the livelong day. But these songs, so the chronicle goes on to say, were composed by a young priest who was afflicted with leprosy and lived a forlorn solitary life, secluded from all the world. You are surely aware, dear reader, what a horrible disease leprosy was during the Middle Ages, and how the wretched beings afflicted with this incurable malady were driven out from all society and from the abodes of men, and were forbidden to approach any human being living. Corpses they wandered to and fro, muffled from head to foot, a hood drawn over the face, and carrying in the hand a bell, the Lazarus bell, as it was called, through which they were to give timely warning of their approach, so that every one could get out of the way in time. The poor priest, whose fame as a lyric poet the chronicle praised so highly, was such a leper. And while all Germany shouting and jubilant sang and whistled his songs, he, a wretched outcast, in the desolation of his misery, sat sorrowful and alone. Oh, that fame was the old familiar scorn, the cruel jest of God, the same as in my case, although there it appears in the romantic garb of the Middle Ages. The blasé king of Judea said rightly, "There is no new thing under the sun." Perhaps that sun itself, which now beams so imposingly, is only an old warmed-up jest. Sometimes among the gloomy phantasms that visit me at night, I seem to see before me the poor priest of the Lüneburg chronicle, my brother in Apollo, and his sorrowful eyes stare strangely out of his hood, but almost at the same moment it vanishes, and faintly dying away like the echo of a dream, I hear the jarring tones of the Lazarus bell. Printed by W. Alter Scott, Felling Newcastle-upon-Tyne. The Canterbury Poets. In shilling monthly volumes square 8 vo well, printed on fine toned paper with redline border, and strongly bound in cloth, each volume contains from 300 to 350 pages, with introductory notices by William Sharp, Mathilda Blind, Walter Lewin, John Hogben, A. J. Symington, Joseph Skipsey, Eva Hope, John Richmond, Ernest Rhys, Percy E. Pinkerton, Mrs. Garden, Dean Carrington, Dr. J. Bradshaw, Frederick Cooper, Hun, Roden, Noel, J. Addington Simmons, G. Willis, Cook, Eric, Mackay, Eric, S. Robertson, William Tyerbuck, Stuart J. Reed, Mrs. Frailegrath, Croker, J. Logie Robertson, Roman 1000a, Samuel Waddington, etc., etc. The following volumes are now ready. Christian Year by Rev. John Keble Coleridge, edited by Joseph Skipsey Longfellow, edited by Eva Hope Campbell, edited by J. Hogben Shelley, edited by J. Skipsey Wordsworth, edited by A. J. Symington Blake, edited by Joseph Skipsey Whittier, edited by Eva Hope Poe, edited by Joseph Skipsey Chatterton, edited by John Richmond Burns Poems Burns Songs, edited by Joseph Skipsey Marlowe, edited by P. E. Pinkerton Keats, edited by John Hogben Herbert, edited by Ernest Rhys Victor Hugo, translated by Dean Carrington Cowper, edited by Eva Hope Shakespeare Songs, Poems and Sonnets, edited by William Sharp Emerson, edited by W. Lewin Sonnets of the Century, edited by William Sharp Whitman, edited by E. Rhys Scott Marmion, etc. Scott Lady of the Lake, etc. edited by William Sharp Preed, edited by Fred Cooper Hogg, by his daughter Mrs. Garden Goldsmith, edited by William Tyerbuck, Love Letters of a Violinist by Aaron Mackay Spencer, edited by Hun, Roden, Noel, Children of the Poets, edited by Eric S. Robertson, Ben Jonson, edited by J. A. Symonds, Byron 2 vols, edited by Mathilda Blind, The Sonnets of Europe, edited by S. Waddington Allen Ramsay, edited by J. Logie Robertson Sidney Doble, edited by Mrs. Doble Pope, edited by John Hogben Heine, edited by Mrs. Croker Beaumont Fletcher, edited by J. S. Fletcher Bowles Lamb and Hartley Coleridge, edited by William Tyerbuck, Early English Poetry, edited by H. Macaulay Fitzgibbon Sea Music, edited by Mrs. Sharp Herrick, edited by Ernest Rhys Ballads, and Rondos, edited by J. Gleason White. Monthly shilling volumes. The Camelot Series. Already issued. Romance of King Arthur, edited by E. Rhys. Thoreau's Walden, edited by W. H. Dirks. Confessions of an English Opium Eater, edited by William Sharp. Landor's Conversations, edited by H. Ellis. Plutarch's Lives, edited by B. J. Snell, Roman 1000a. Sir Thomas Browne's Religio Medici, etc., edited by J. Addington Simmons. Shelley's Essays and Letters, edited by Ernest Rhys. Prose Writings of Swift, edited by W. Lewin. My Study Windows, edited by R. Garnet, Roman 100, Roman 500, Great English Painters, edited by W. Sharp. Lord Byron's Letters, edited by Roman 1000, Blind. Essays by Leigh Hunt, edited by A. Symonds. Longfellow's Prose, edited by W. Tyerbuck. Great Musical Composers, edited with introduction by Mrs. Sharp. Marcus Aurelius, edited by Alice Zimmern. Specimen Days in America by Walt Whitman. White's Natural History of Selborne, edited with introduction by Richard Jefferies. Defoe's Captain Singleton, edited with introduction by H. Halliday Sparling. Essays Literary and Political by Joseph Mazzini, with introduction by William Clark. The Prose Writings of Heinrich Heine, with introduction by Havelock Ellis. Monthly shilling volumes. Great Writers. A new series of critical biographies. Edited by Professor E. S. Robertson. Already issued. Life of Longfellow by Professor Eric S. Robertson. The story of the poet's life is well told. The remarks on Longfellow, as a translator, are excellent. Saturday Review. No Better Life of Longfellow has been published. Glasgow Herald. Life of Coleridge by Hall Caine. The Scotsman says it is a capital book written throughout with spirit and great literary skill. The bibliography is unusually full and adds to the value of the work. Life of Dickens by Frank T. Marzials. An interesting and well-written biography. Scotsman. Life of Dante, Gabriel Rossetti by Joseph Knight. Life of Samuel Johnson by Carl F. Grant. Life of Darwin by G.T. Bettany. Charlotte Bront by Augustine Birrell. Life of Thomas Carlyle by Richard Garnett Roman, 100 Roman, 500 Life of Adam Smith by R.B. Haldane Roman 1000 p. Ready September 26th. Life of Keats by W. Roman 1000 Rossetti. To be followed on October 25th by Life of Shelley by William Sharp. Volumes in preparation by Austin Dobson Cannon, Venables, James Syme Edmund Goss Professor Knight etc. Library edition of Great Writers. An issue of all the volumes in this series will be published printed on large paper of extra quality, in handsome, binding demi 8 vo price 2s. 6d per volume. Now ready Part 1 price 6d by post 7d. The Naturalist's Monthly. A journal for nature lovers and nature thinkers. Edited by Dr. J. W. Williams, Roman 1000a. Contents. Pathology of the Celandine Rev Hilderic Friend, Roman 1000a f Roman 50, s. The evolution of the fishing hook, from the flint hook of prehistoric man, to the salmon hook of the present-day Edward. Love it a study in my garden Rosaphus H. W. S. Worsley Benissen, f Roman 50, s. Binary Sons, Herbert Sadler FRAS Charles Robert Darwin with a photograph B. Middleton Bachelor Shell Collecting in Guernsey and Hearn, J. R. Brockton Tomlin, B.A. A chapter on the centipedes, and Millipedes T. Roman 500 Gibson Carmichael Roman 1000 A. F. Roman 50 S. The Snails and Slugs of My Garden George Roberts The Origin of Our Freshwater Faunas H. E. Quilter, Reviews General Notes and Gleanings Reports of the Learned Societies. A sound journal, the monthly advent of which will be awaited with feelings of satisfaction and pleasure. Bath Chronicle. To the student of nature who has had few opportunities of study, just such a magazine as this supplies a felt want. We trust that an appreciative public will ensure the success of this new magazine Midlothian Journal. This neatly got-up magazine seems to supply a vacant place in the ranks of serial literature, and to supply it well. Nottingham Guardian. Part 2, ready September 26th, annual subscription 7 shillings, post free. London Walter Scott, 24 Warwick Lane, Paternoster Row.